as always. I don't know how I did that, but okay. Alrighty. Where were we? Yeah, that was pulling up my computer to look at it. Oh, right. Yeah, I was dealing with the debates tonight. Don't want to talk about it. Don't want to deal with it. Too many arguments with people I know about what the right way to go with that is. So I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to talk about it. We're coming up on midnight here anyway. It's almost too late to do this. World building. And in sort of me tradition, complicated world building. So my standard setting of the Empyrean realm that I'm using as the base for my campaign world is a world with holes in it. This is, I guess, the best way I can think to put that. It's a world with slots that you can slot in other worlds. It's a meta world, a multiverse, a multi-setting campaign. I don't know how else to phrase that, but it's a world with holes in it. And those holes can be filled by some of the other settings. I discussed a little bit about Sentinels, and I may get back to that later. But considering the things I've been talking about lately and the big thing on the mind in the country right now with pandemic concerns is a world in which an infectious problem sort of ends society and culture. So let's see if I can pull up. I had a recent restart, so let's hope I didn't lose anything valuable on my computer. That automatic restart when you're in the middle of doing things. Get up to go to the bathroom for a minute, you come back from the bathroom and your computer's rebooted, and I hope you didn't lose anything in the time frame. But yeah, so pull up my Vestiges campaign. I do feel like one of the things I want to do for each of these settings is sort of what I did with the Empyrean Realm setting idea was each setting has its sort of thematic elements for character design, racial histories, and cultural aspects. So like where I'm in the Empyrean Realm, we have the Dwergar, who are the dwarves, and they have a very Slavic Art Deco mentality. I feel like I want to do something similar for my individual world settings. And so the world of Olean, which comes from this is one of those naming things that I did where Lien from Icelandic means domain or realm, and Oli in Dutch means oil. So Olean is sort of a portmanteau of oil and realm or domain. So it's the oil world or something like that. It's not anything somebody fluent in either of those languages, Icelandic or Dutch, would do, I don't imagine. I'm sure it would be just as confusing to them as it is to somebody not speaking either of those languages. So I don't pretend it's linguistically pure, but for my needs and entertainment, I guess, it sort of suits. So Olean is the world, and the Olean realm or Olean domain is a world in which you want to establish it as being very. I'm debating whether or not I want to move up towards the very edge of steampunk. I'm feeling like I really don't. I want it to be very fantasy still. I want it to not quite Lord of the Rings though. I'm trying to figure out where, if I were to to equate it to, because it really feels honestly like I want it to feel a little bit more like I sort of want it to feel like Greco-Roman city-states. That were essentially the nations of the time. And I also want it to feel like the world was so well conquered that, like in modern times in our world, there is no part of our world that I can just walk through and not be on somebody else's property. You know what I mean? Like you have the adventures of like Lord of the Rings. When you leave the Shire and you're not yet in oh God, what's the name of that city? Rivendell. When you're at it is the town where the prancing pony is. Why are all my broadcasts being interrupted? That's obnoxious. All right, so I'm gonna have to maybe play with some settings on this in the near future. I don't know. Anyway, every night that I've been doing this now, it keeps interrupting me, telling me I'm losing signal. So if we lose it tonight, we lose it tonight. I can't do anything about it. Anyway, so in the Lord of the Rings, you have the Shire, which is sort of more like a town, a very rural town. You have the village where the prancing pony is. Then you have Rivendell, and you have Mordor, and the regions of Rohan, which, I mean, you can walk between them and you're sort of in random places. They don't belong to anybody. They're not unexplored. They know that there's the myrk wood forests and those types of things. But they're not really generally a lived in or controlled domain. They're sort of just dots on a map with space between them. They're sort of treated like in science fiction, where you've got the Earth system, and then you have Alpha Centauri, and those are locations. What's between them doesn't matter. And a lot of like fantasy looks at a world like that, where there are locations and then there travel between locations. And the travel, you pull up on the side of the road, throw up a tent, you camp there. You don't really do that in modern US. I do get the sense that there's some areas of Europe where you can do hiking like that and it's not a big problem. But you don't really get away with that in the US, especially not along the coasts of the US. I get a sense that there's some trekking you can do and wilderness camping you can do in the middle of the country, but I wouldn't barter too much on the fact that that's not a sort of a quirk of some of the rules of some things there. But I want to have that sense of a world where at the time of the major event of the world of Olean, this is a world that may have been more like mythic Greco-Roman city-states, but in a way, very much like modern U.S., I guess U.S., it may be other parts of the world too, where the world isn't space between cities. It's all like the boundaries of a town meet up with the boundaries of the next town. There's no free-for-all space. There's no, in this realm are monsters and exploration. Like the whole world was explored, charted, everybody knew, and there are well-traveled paths. it's one big, giant, sprawling rural suburb. Not really a phrase, but I don't know how else to call it. And I want that feeling because it has to be important for, like, the idea of alien is eventually what you're going to have happen in the past. That's a weird phrase. Eventually, what's going to happen in the past is this myrk, this infectious monster emerges and spreads, which is very appropriate for the current pandemic time frame. But it can't be something that, like, it has to feel alien. It's not something that could have just existed in the space between this town and the next town. When you have a historical setting where the towns are the focal points and anything can lie between them, the problem with that is anything could be there. And therefore, it's not surprising when something is. You know what I mean? Like, having a setting where the world tells you these are the things in it, and then one of these days that world is broken because something that shouldn't have been there was there. Arrived, showed up, broke through, was born. The wonder of a cryptozoology experience is with something like the Jersey Devil or the El Chupacabra is like, this is Carl's land. His neighbor is Steve. There's no hidden caves or dark, murky portals to hell hidden in areas around here. We know this area. My kids played here when they were little. I raised my dog. We go for hikes in the woods out in this area. This isn't like a mysterious place where phantoms and monsters emerge. It's just the woods outside Carl's house. Like, that feeling of like a betrayal of something unnatural emerging in a place where everything was known to be a certain way, that's more important for this setting, I feel. So I kind of want to pull that tendency, and doing it in a fantasy role-playing setting, I kind of feel like it's also fun to do this classic community town. Like, this is usually a genre of story that's told in a 1950s, a maybe even you could go to the late 1800s. So like a Victorian, maybe slightly pre-Victorian time frame, all the way through to maybe the 1980s-ish. And it's usually set in that environment where, like, the last edges of the unexplored are where the people who live there have sort of fallen off the map. You get these, I think X-Files did an episode where they had, what was it? A southern house with a family who were so gone, and they lived in a reclusive house, disconnected from the community around them, and they inbred so much, trying to breed back some primal monstrous human. And I was like, that's sort of something you can do, but I kind of want to do this with a mindset of when you do a role-playing game or a classic fantasy setting, you usually have the elves and dwarves and gnomes and whatnot that I've built into some of the other settings here. And it'd be kind of interesting to see if you could build that sort of multi-ethnic multiracial community and have them working with and around one another peaceably. And I kind of want that feeling of like Dawn of the Walking Dead, or I wouldn't say Evil Dead. That one's a little different because they went, if I remember correctly, Evil Dead was like a little more like the classic horror slasher flick where people went for a camping trip in the woods and uncovered some horrible eldritch nightmare, Jason at the undead Jason at Crystal Lake, or the Necronomicon in the cabin, and they read from it and raise an undead army accidentally. And like, I don't want that, although you could do things like that, and I don't mind necessarily building a setting where you could set it before the rise of this infectious myrk, but like I guess you could set the setting up in such a way where you have that, I guess it's what time frame would we call that? It's not quite like, I guess it's atomic age style, but not with atomic age technology. The nuclear family kind of time frame. I guess that's 40s through the 80s sort of time frame, and use it sort of as a callback to like that X-Files episode, where you can have in the background some opportunity before the major events of what I'm going to do with it, wherein people can encounter horrors and monsters hidden in cabins in the woods or a camp for kids or something like that. I guess it doesn't hurt to build that kind of setting where, and it'd be interesting to do it with dwarves and humans and the other races that I've put together here. That would be so weird. And what I would have to do for that, this is getting more fun as I play with it. What I'd have to do for this is, in order to get to that kind of mindset, you have to have sort of similar paths for history, but ones that allow that the other communities around the world are dwarves and elves and whatnot. But also, because I want this to be very similar to a pre-electronic, pre-Steam age technologically, you're going to have to figure out how to give the magical equivalent of some of the things that revolutionized our lives. So, like, the things that changed our lives in a positive way are refrigeration, radio, flying devices. We can fly on planes. The non-sailing ships, that like the steam vessels and whatnot that they've crossed the oceans with. Like, one of the biggest changes is going to be like, do I include guns or not? And that's a hard one to decide on, because here's the thing. Where I'm going with my story for this setting is that whole setting of this fantasy modern times has fallen apart. It's come crumbling down because of this infectious disease. This alien consciousness that invades the bodies of the people it hatches into and just destroys them from the inside out, turning them gradually into monsters, being ridden by this dark myrk that oozes out of their bodies. Like, that's a horror show. That's supposed to be horrible. And it's also supposed to be horrible in a way that's distracting from the fact that the real horror is how we handled it. Well, my rant last night kind of covers where I'm going with some of that, in that people become stupid. People become self-serving. People become monstrous beings in their own way. And that sort of has to be the dilemma of the setting for where I'm going with it, in that it's not, there are monsters outside and we're seeking refuge in these little enclaves that built walls around themselves to protect themselves and quarantine themselves in to protect against the invasion of these infected things beyond. It's beyond these walls are infected monsters, but inside these walls are non-infected monsters. And the decision to be like, where should we be, gets even more complicated when the player characters and the players themselves confront the issue of, well, outside these walls are monsters that are infectious tar beasts that take over a body, and inside these walls are people like you and me. Well, when the consequences of this gameplay come into play, some of you will be like the people inside the walls. Some of you are going to be like the people inside these walls, joined like conjoined twins with something from outside the walls. Some of you are going to be able to speak to and control and mind meld with the things outside the wall. And some of you are unknowingly going to be one of the things from outside the wall. And so it's blurring that line between which set of monsters you belong to and making you question where you fit in it all. And I'm not going to make it like, oh, these things on the outside, if you're one of them, then everything will be hunky-dory. No, there's still going to be monstrous, horrible beings. Some of the ones that you have to imagine it sort of like the first person who ever tamed a wild dog, or some of those like science fiction tropes of, you get the two warring parties, you get one person of each party crash landed on a planet and they have to struggle together to survive. And in that struggle to survive together, they learn enough about each other that they can form a partnership and are the potential means of reaching a peaceful resolution to the conflict between both sides. That's one example of a type of story that comes from this kind of two worlds colliding kind of mindset. But it's not going to change the fact that that side is murdering our people. And I'm still debating whether or not I wanted to also be invading animals of certain kinds. Because like the image of an infected zombie human is one thing. That's pretty graphic. That horrible turn the mind of a human into some bestial creature as the infection spreads out from inside their body and sends dark tar-colored spikes that they used to shred other living beings with. That can be terrifying. But what if it does it to all the other creatures around? Like your cattle farms, suddenly just an infection spreads and it's just terrifying. So what do you do for food? How do you control that? Like, in a world where people have to hold up inside of fortresses, it's like siege warfare. But siege warfare in a setting where like you can't set up a large farm outside the walls, because invading monsters are going to come storming through there and destroy everything that you do, and it makes you more vulnerable. Like, so like how do you manage that? And the point that needs to be set up for this setting to feel the way I want it to feel is they're not making it. The odds that they're going to, I mean, this is a world that they're not going to survive, but they're not dying tomorrow. The people are just literally waiting and biding their time until they can't keep going anymore. And that sort of lost hopelessness, that's got to be part of the background feel of the setting. So yeah, in that setting, that's what I'm trying to figure out what the right way to do that is. I do want the different races, and here's one of the things I've been playing at a little bit. Now, it sort of causes me to broach into the other two settings, but in the Medusa setting, the Serpent's Children, the different races of Medusa that I'm using as the base for the player characters, those are the only intelligent life on that world. If you notice, when I talk about the Empyrean realm, there are no Medusa as a playable race in that setting. But if the Empyrean realm is supposed to be the realm of the gods for each of these worlds, then how are the Serpent's Children not represented there? And so there's a little bit of that question of like, these races on the Serpent's Children setting are new races. They're not the same as the races of the gods. And so part of the appeal of that is when you're playing in each of those settings, if you really like the character that you have and you want to bring them into the realm of the gods so that they can then become the new god in their form. So a Medusa from the Serpent's Children setting transcends into the realm of the gods and becomes a goddess. She would be a Medusan goddess, the first Medusan goddess to cross into that realm. And so I kind of want each of these settings to take into account that I don't want them to be heavily inhabited with the divine races. So like the Sentinel setting is predominantly humans. You may have something like an elf or a dwarf or something like that playing as the Superman role, the last son of Krypton, or whatever you want to do. You may also have Inhumans that take on an aspect of one of the divine races, usually going to be the vampiric or the wares or the genies or the demons or angelic beings. But those in themselves, each of those, like, there aren't really a vampire, there's not really a vampire race in the Empyrean realm. There are the elves and there are ghosts, but not really anything specifically vampiric. And there's not really a genie per se. They're elemental beings. They're very similar. There's nothing really werewolf or demonic or angelic. The demonic and angelic are actually the ones that come closest to being ones that you find in the Empyrean realm. But the mutations I have to be careful with. Of my mutations right here, I have Harpy, Doppelganger, Troll, Dragonborn. Those mutations, they do have equivalents in the Empyrean realm. So I do want to be a little bit careful about minimizing the chances of having an Empyrean realm entity in each of these subworlds. I want it to be the chance to be the first of your kind in the Empyrean realm if you choose that race to transcend with. So the reason I bring that up is when you go into the Serpent's Children realm, you have the Medusan races, which none of them have an equivalent in the Empyrean realm. So when we move down into the Myrk Riders setting, the Olean, the tendency I have is to want a traditional fantasy setting, but I want to be careful about introducing elves, dwarves, gnomes, and whatnot, or kobolds, or trolls, or half giants, or however you want to do that, because they are not as foreign to the Empyrean realm. Now, the Dwergar that I'm using Empyrean realms versus regular dwarves, I can make some sub-race distinctions there. But I'm trying to figure out what the right way to go with that is. And so the technology that we have, what's that one with Mila Jovovich or whatever her name is? Is it Resident Evil? Where the Umbrella Corporation causes the zombie outbreak, I think. Okay, so Resident Evil movies, I think, was what the films, live action film series, yeah. Capcom survival horror video game. So, I mean, I may look into a little bit more. I know I saw the first movie in the series, and I know it's based off of a video game. I don't know that I've watched much past that because it seems like it was just a classic first-person shooter movie franchise, and it wasn't really it wasn't heavy on story at that point. It was literally just people shooting monsters, and that's fine. It's not usually my speed, but I want the setting we're going into to have a narrative story element of very distinctive goals and interests of trying to survive and figure out how this world works now. It's there was a movie years ago called Final Fantasy: The Spirit Within, and it also included a theme of an invasive type of creature that destroyed the world and the people who were trying to fight that invasion. And I want some of those elements from it. And that story had an element that included the idea that you're looking for the key to destroy this monster, and then you find out what these monsters were, and that maybe destruction of one side or the other wasn't the only path through this. If I remember, it's been a long time since I saw that movie. So I'd like to see. I'll do some read up on some of the details on some of these things, but so Final Fantasy Spirit Within. So I'm giving myself more homework to do. Let's see, Spirit Within. There we go. Yeah, that was. I think I have that movie on DVD somewhere. But the idea of taking that 1950s to 1980s modern Earth done as an urban fantasy. I mean, at this rate, it's almost more like the Harry Potter wizarding realm. So if you took the Harry Potter wizarding realm and used it to excuse all the technology we have around us, so that cars never worked as internal combustion engines, they were only functional horseless carriages run by phantom spirits trapped into a box placed under the hood, like that sort of thing, where it's, or maybe to a certain degree, like a Flintstones thing, where I had a weird Flintstones dream last night, actually. But essentially, like, all the appliances are run by animals or spirits of some kind that are the thing that does what you need it to do. So essentially, like, there isn't electric razors that work. They're two blades put together with something buzzing around inside to make it work. It doesn't work through electricity. And so, like, being able to figure out building a world where you can kind of portray it as parallel to our own, but instead of electricity and gasoline and steam power, it's magic powered. And then build that out to the logical conclusion of reaching modern society kind of ways. And from there, like, it's weird to have to build a setting that you're supposed to be destroying. Like, I have to build a history. I have to build a setting. I have to figure out what animals they're using. Like, do they have just regular cows and horses? Or are we doing this differently enough that it's truly different? And, you know, what was their equivalent of the World War or things like that? And then following that, where were we in that process when the world ended? And how did that happen? How did that event get triggered? I don't know that I want it to be a triggered event, but I don't necessarily want it necessarily to be, I don't want it to be completely random either. Ooh, I got to be real careful with some of this, because there is the temptation to do something more along the lines of, like, what if they were dabbling with breeding different Pokemon style utilitarian animals, and they accidentally created a Mewtwo, which was the big, you know, monstrous thing that they confronted in one of the episodes of, like, I think it was one of the movies. I think they're remaking that movie as a live action or a computer generated version. But that idea that you create the super being for the powerful utility animals, and that AI or animal intelligence decides that the world would be better without your kind in it, and then decides to try to wipe you all out. Like, that's one path you could take with this. That is deliberately not what I'm trying to do here. I want this setting to be kind of similar to Stranger Things, where you've accidentally brought over a creature from another realm that your world doesn't have the ability to handle. And that creature infects and destroys your world. I kind of want it to be that kind of way. How to suss that out? What's the triggering event that makes that happen? There's always that temptation to have that cautionary tale. Don't read random spell books you find in a cabin in the woods. Don't meddle in the genetics of the creatures around you in fear of something going wrong. Don't make a self-aware computer because they'll try to overthrow us. Like that cautionary tale is always sort of there as a temptation, but I feel like it's a little bit of a lazy temptation. I don't want it to be like, well, we got too curious and this is the consequence. I don't want it to be that. But you have to set it up in such a way that this wasn't something that was always just sitting off in the woods waiting for us. I mean, alien invasion kind of thing. I usually like there to be a little bit more of a profound thought behind a thing happening. I like it to be like, there's a reason why this is the consequence, not, well, I just thought it would be fun to throw in this weird monster that destroyed the entire world. No. There's a fittingness to it. Like, well, of course this happened. Like, if you did a lot of atomic bomb testing over the Galapagos Islands and then one of those iguanas mutated into a giant kaiju, of course it did. You were not being responsible about how you treated your environment and the creatures in it. I don't know. I'll have to think about that one a little bit more. And with my late start today and where we are right now, I think we're kind of hitting the end point for tonight. We're almost at 45 minutes. So I don't know that my plan was to talk about the Myrk Riders setting tonight, but that's sort of where some of my brain's been. So I have no idea what we'll discuss tomorrow. Maybe more Myrk Riders, maybe more Sentinels. Maybe we'll dip into the Serpent's Children. But until then, thanks for joining me. Take care and have a good night. All right. Buenos noches. Pasta bañan.